Hello and welcome to the latest in my stitch quilt finishing tutorial series. If you're not sure what the stitch quilt is, you might want to check out this video, which I'm linking here and also down below, which introduces the whole stitch quilt project, where we are using cross stitch to make hexagons, quilt-as-you-go hexagons. These are all hand stitched, and as you can see, each hexagon is fully finished as you go. I'm doing a series of tutorials to show you some of the ways that you can then use these quilt-as-you-go hexagons to make up different kinds of finishing projects. So far there's a needle case, there's going to be an ornament, I think there's going to be a project bag, there's one or two other things, but today we're looking at how you can make a hexagon pillow. For this tutorial, for this finishing, you'll need 8 hexagons. Now I've got one stitched hexagon, and then I have got 2, 4, 6, 7 fabric hexagons, and you can see I've chosen to do mine in pairs, and then one that's kind of like the pair of the stitched piece but just with fabric inside. These have all just got pretty fabric. I'm using some Tilda fabrics here, some Tilda chambrays as the plain colours on the outside, and some Tilda patterned fabric in the hexagons. I cannot now remember what the name of this line is. I bought a pack of 5-inch charm squares of this line to use for this project. So you'll need 8 hexagons altogether. You'll need some sewing thread and a needle, scissors, and you'll need some stuffing. I've just got some fibre fill here. I might add, I think I've got some lavender, some dried lavender that I might also add into mine as well when we get to that. But that's all you'll need for this finishing project. If you're not sure how to finish the individual hexagons, there's a separate tutorial for how you get from your stitch piece to your hexagon piece like this. So there's the introduction to stitch quilt, there's the stitch quilt hexagon finishing tutorial, and then all the other tutorials are based on that one. If you don't know where to find the charts, again, it'll be linked below, but they're essentially available during the stitch along on my Instagram and in my Facebook page. They will later become a paid pattern in my Etsy shop. I'm using G is for garden for this project. So what we're going to do, we're going to begin by arranging our hexagons. I'm going to take the one that sort of matches my stitched one and put that to one side for the moment. I'm going to take my stitched one and put that in the center, and then I'm going to arrange the rest of my hexagons around it. And I think I want mine lined up so they're the sort of opposite pairs like this, but you can do all 6 different, you could do all of them the same. You could even use more stitch pieces here if you wanted to, although you'll want to wait and see, I think, exactly how this project works out. I'm not sure I would choose to do that. I think you would end up with some of the pieces, yeah, not being shown to their best advantage. So I think it works really well with one stitch piece like this, but it's up to you. Obviously you could do more if you wanted. Like I say, we're going to finish this as a pillow. Somebody did show me a link to an Etsy pattern for like a little bowl that you could make that uses a very, very similar technique. And I will just point out to you when we get to it how you might do that bowl technique. But we are just going to do the pillow here. So we're going to stitch these hexagons together, and we're going to hand stitch. I'm going to talk to you about the order in which we do that. Hexagons are slightly annoying. If you've ever stitched hexagons before of any kind, you'll find you can end up doing really quite annoyingly short little lines between them. So we're going to start at an outside corner and come in and then along. And then what we want to do is come out to here and do the next thing again. So we're just going to slide our needle. You could stop and start, but don't. It's really annoying. We're just going to slide our needle around the back to here and then stitch the next 2 sides. Slide our needle along and stitch the next 2, and so on until we get all the way round. If you don't want to do that, obviously you can just stop and start as often as you like. Because we're making a pillow, ours is going to be entirely contained on the inside. So even though this is fully finished, there are no raw edges, this is not going to be visible, this backside. I mean, it's pretty even just with those colours, isn't it? So we're not going to worry too much about what this looks like, which means we can easily use this for starting and finishing our threads. We can leave hanging threads if we want to. And we're not going to worry too much about how visible our stitches are. If you're using a technique where you're going to be able to see the reverse of this, so if you were making this into a hanging or a quilt, you know, something like that, where the reverse would be visible, you would obviously want to pay more attention to making sure that this also looks neat, with all the ends nicely finished. Okay, so let's put it back front ways. And I'm going to start by threading threading my needle. I can now find a suitable needle. It's a bit tiny. They're all slightly too tiny or slightly too huge, as is the way that one will be. Okay, and I'm just using normal sewing thread, and I'm using mine, it's maybe a slightly darker grey than would be ideal for these colours. But if you're stitching together hexagons with lots of different colours, your best bet is to go for something like a palish grey or beige that will hide into pretty much everything. So I'm going to start by putting my two that I'm going to join wrong sides together, right sides together, wrong sides facing. Thank you. And in fact, depending whether you're right-handed or left-handed, you can stitch left to right or right to left. Okay, and I'm just going to pop my needle in, and because I'm not worried about how this is going to be visible, I'm just going to pop it in through the back. It doesn't go through the front at this point. You can tie a knot if you're that sort of person. I generally try and avoid knots in my hand sewing, but you know, up to you. So I would just do, oh, this thread is going to be annoying, isn't it? And it's already wanting to get things. So I just do 3 little stitches on top of each other, and that will hold it in place. But you can tie a knot if you want. Okay, and then I'm going to take my needle and through both of the corners of my 2 hexagons, right on the corner. And then what I would do, because you always want your corners to be really nice and tight, that's where if there's ever going to be a hole, it's going to come at your corner. So I would always do a second little stitch there. And what you can do as well is just make what's called a little locking stitch. So where I've got this not quite pulled in, there's the loop of the thread. These tutorials are harder than you'd think, right? Can you see this? I'm doing this in a different position than I did the last one because it kept getting cut off the camera. There we go. So there's the loop of my stitch, and I'm just going to put my needle through that and pull it tight, and that will give the corner a really nice tight hold. Now, because we're not going to see this, I am just going to do a little whip stitch. If you're doing this for a quilt or something where the back is going to be visible, I would recommend a ladder stitch, and I'll maybe show you that in a minute. But just a little whip stitch, so over the top, you just, you know, there we go, top and back. Okay, you probably want to aim for 1 stitch every, well, certainly every 1/4 inch, and maybe a little bit smaller than that. Definitely if you wanted to stuff your thing with walnut shells, I would recommend machine stitching a lining for it. But if you're not going to do that, you really want to stitch this very small stitches if you're going to do that. I'm not. I'm going to do the polyfill, and like I say, I might put some lavender seeds in, but I'll put them in inside the polyfill. Okay, so we stitch all the way along, get to the next corner, needle through the corner, needle through the corner again, and this time, once again, needle through the loop of the stitch, pull it tight. I am going to stitch along here. So this time I'm going to put those 2 together. and come in again at the corner. So I've got 3 hexagons joining at that corner, but at this point I'm only going to stitch 2 of the seams. Okay, so again through the corner where there is a loop of thread, put my needle through it and pull it tight. Okay, and then I'm going to go and do the ladder stitch, not the ladder stitch, the whip stitch. Oh, what am I doing today? Right, we're doing the whip stitch all the way across here. As with your cross stitching, you will always be recommended to not have enormous lengths of thread in your needle. I tend to push that as far as I reasonably can, but you do run the risk of getting even more knots than I'm getting today if you go further. So, I mean, it's perfectly fine to, you know, stop and start. What you don't want to be doing is every time you get to the end of 2 or even just 1 little seam like this, having to stop and start again. Okay, so the corner again, needle through again, and just hook your needle through that loop. Okay, so they're all lying nice and flat, and now I'm ready to do the pink one. Now you see, this is where we need to think about it. I could just stitch along here and then I'm stuck. So what I'm going to do is take my needle to this point. Okay, so on the back, I'm just going to do a couple of little stitches just to make sure that the thread is being kept out of the way of the seam, and I'm going to come back up at the end of the needle. So you can see I've just sewn that there. I've not sewn it through the front, but now when I come to sew my next seam, I'm in the right place, and I'm going to sew this pink one. Okay, I'm not going to sew all of these on camera. I'm doing this standing up in an attempt to have a slightly better viewing angle than on my last tutorial, but I don't really want to stitch the whole thing standing up unless I have to. So I'm just putting my needle through, pulling it into the lock. Okay, make sure all your previous hexagons are out of the way. Okay, and then we're just going to do the whip stitch along this seam. In general, a whip stitch is a good stitch to use when you are sewing right sides together and you're not going to see the actual stitching. You don't want to use a whip stitch, and I've talked about this before, if you are, for example, sewing up the hole that you've left in a pillow when you've turned it the right side around, because that's on the outside of your work and the whip stitch will be very visible. You definitely want to use a ladder stitch or a mattress stitch. I think they are the same stitch for something like that. Okay, as predicted, my thread has got tangled. Give me a second. Got a knot in it. Happens to all of us. Happens annoyingly on camera just as much as it does in real life. I think this is quite old thread. My grandparents used to run a shop which, amongst other things, sold haberdashery, and I inherited a lot of the contents of the shop. And this Silco thread for 89p, well, I don't know, that's got a label on actually, which would not have been from there. I think that's from Woolworths. But anyway, it's still quite old. Okay, I'm coming up to the thing, so I'm putting my needle through the corners, through the corner again, and just slipping my needle through that loop to hold it nice and tightly in place. Okay, and so now I'm here, and obviously I'm going to go along this thread. When I get to this corner, I'm going to stitch underneath to the outside and then stitch 2. stitch underneath to the outside, stitch 2. Okay, so I'm going to just go away and work on all of that until I've got these 6 in a flower together. Great, so I've sewn all of these together. You can see on the back it's not the neatest. I've got the bits where the thread is sewn by the back. There was one, I think it might have been this one, where I had to start a new thread, so there isn't any there, but you've got the ends of the thread. The whip stitch is not super neat, but it's fine because once you turn it over, you don't see it. And this is the outside. Now, doesn't yet look much of a pillow. It's actually much nearer than you might think. What we need to do is turn it over, and we're going to take our 8th hexagon and put that on top of the stitched hexagon. So this is the reverse side, wrong sides together. Okay, and we're going to be folding over like this. So essentially we're going to do the same stitching again. I'm going to stitch along this side and out, along this side and out, and at each corner I'll do the same thing of slipping the thread back to where I want it to carry on. Okay, if you were doing the version where you were doing a bowl rather than a pillow, what you would do at this point is not stitch this on. You would just be stitching up these side seams here, and you probably would need to do each one separately. Okay, and you would have them so they went all the way around to make a larger hexagon like that. Now we're going to do this, but we're going to have our hexagon in the middle. So we're going to need to make sure we leave enough space to stuff our pillow. So I'm going to make sure I leave a whole hexagon side like this open. So I'll stitch across and down, across and down, across and down, across and down, across. Okay, and then I'll stop here where I've got 3 whole sides still to go. So just the same way I did before. Now you can do this from the inside or the outside. We're going to do it from the inside, so then we can stitch using exactly the same method, and then we'll turn our cushion the right side out before stitching. So we're going to do it from the inside. We're going to want the right side up, the right side down. Okay, and then I'm going to start by stitching those 2 together there. Wrong sides, right sides together. I keep saying that, wrong sides together, and I mean right sides together. There we go, and this way around, because of the way that I like to stitch. So I'm just going to, again, this is not going to be seen on the inside, so I'm not going to worry about making my end super neat. I'm just going to do my 3 little stitches to hold it tight. Okay, you can see I'm pulling that quite tight. 3 little stitches, just so if you prefer to do a knot, you absolutely can. Start right at the corner, stitch it together again, and before you pull it tight, pop your needle through just to give it an extra little knot. Okay, and then we're going to do the whip stitch as before along each seam. Okay, and I'll just show you the first couple so you can get an idea of how it's going to come together. Okay, this really is not a super long process. They're short seams. You haven't got any raw edges left at this point to be tucking in or dealing with or faffing about. You do not have to use your machine. Indeed, often with hexagons, machines are not the easiest way of doing it. Quilts that have hexagons in them and are machined tend to be made with half hexagon shapes and then the 2 half hexagons sewn together to avoid awkward corners. But when you're doing it by hand, you don't have to worry. So I've sewn that one on. Let's have it the right way. So we're doing it, remember, inside out, So that's it. So my next one that I want to stitch is going to be this seam here. Okay, I've come along here and I'm going to come out there. So I want those two next to each other like that. Okay, and once again, I prefer to stitch from right to left. And I'm starting right in the corner, once, twice, hook it through for a knot. Okay, and then whip stitch along that side. It will become, obviously, as you're doing this, more and more three-dimensional. You can be quite ruthless at sort of moving out the pieces you're not stitching out of the way. You know, it's all quite forgiving. It's all just soft and fabric. Mine have got the hexiforms inside them. If you're using other quilt wadding or batting, the same should be true. You could use stiffer interfacing, particularly again if you're doing this sort of basket idea rather than the pillow. You might want to use a stiffer interfacing. Something like a soft and stable would work really well for that, I think, probably, or a fusible fleece maybe. Okay, all the way to the end, hook it in, and then so you can see it's starting to be more three-dimensional. So fold the back, the bottom one into the middle every time, so you can just check where you are. Okay, and my thread is here, but the next seam I want to stitch is here, so I'm going to move my thread down the side seam. Just a couple of big running stitches, not going through to the front, ending up right at the corner. Okay, and then I'm going to stitch along here. It will become pretty intuitive, but do just check each seam that it is all folding in the correct way. So I'll just show you one more through the corner and hook it, and then whip stitch along here. Okay, so each time you should get 2 seams continuously, and then 1 seam where you're just passing the thread along. If you're struggling to work out the principle of this continuous seam, I mean, you can just stop and start every time. It's not the end of the world. If I'm not making sense to you, do go and check out Emma Jones at the Vintage Sewing Box. Her videos are linked on my Stitchquilt playlist, and she talks about this continuous method for English paper piecing, specifically for hexagons, in one of her videos, and it's probably much clearer than mine because she does a lot more tutorials than me. Okay, so right along to the corner, second stitch, hook the loop through. Okay, and once again, just to make sure we know where we are, have I done this right? Yes. Okay, always put your middle hexagon on top of your middle hexagon, and then you can check everything is folding the way that it should. So I'm going to carry on now stitching down this blue corner. So I'm going to go along here and down. Then I'm going to put the green one in, along and down, and finally the pink one. And remember, I'm going to end with this whole hexagon open. Okay, I'll be back in a minute. Okay, so this is what it looks like so far. I'm going to just flatten it down. As always, that central hexagon on top of the inside central hexagon. So you can see the shape it's going to end up. This one, 3 seams still yet to sew. And at this point, we're going to turn it the right way around. Again, you can be quite rough with it. If you stitched it properly, it won't fall apart. Good test. And if you stitch it properly, you won't see your seams on the outside. You won't, I promise. Okay, so we're stitching it. None of the corners are particularly sharp because of the way the hexagon folds work. And you'll find that stitching it together in this way is much easier to turn out than if you were machine stitching. So that's what it looks like from the front. That's what it looks like from the back. And so obviously we're going to fill it at this point. I think you don't want to fill it too full because you do want the hexagon shape not to get distorted too much. You know how when you've got a really full rectangular pillow, the sides almost end up kind of curved in. And I think it would be a shame if these curve in too much. So I'm just taking bits of polyfill and stuffing them in, smallish bits at a time, into the points. Obviously, you want to make sure that those are nicely pointed out. Once I've got a fair amount in all the points, I am going to add, like I said, some lavender to this. I don't always add lavender into pillows, but I think it's a nice little touch, and something like this would certainly be small enough that someone could use it as a lavender bag. I just bought this bag of dried lavender for decoration only, not for human consumption. I do quite like the taste of lavender. Waitrose used to do a really nice lavender shortbread. I don't think they do it anymore. You have to be careful because as soon as you put too much in, it really does taste revolting. But just a gentle flavour of lavender, I do quite like. Anyway, I'm just going to put a couple of scoops of that in there. Not too much because of the hand sewing. I don't want it to be overflowing with lavender. I wouldn't use walnut shells with my hand sewing. If you do very tight hand sewing, you might get away with it, or you might want to put some kind of lining between the walnut shells and your stitching. So I'm just going to keep stuffing. I feel like this is a good sort of thickness of pillow that I'm quite liking. As always, it's slightly tricky, isn't it? So stuffing it right to the end where you've got to sew it up. So we'll put a fair chunk in. We'll make sure I'm happy with how it's stuffed in each of those corners, which I could just do with a little bit more there, I think, and a little bit more there. Okay, and then we're going to fold this up and we're going to sew this closed. And just before I finish the last bit of sewing, I will just see whether I need to add any more stuffing. Now this time, because the stitching is going to be on the outside, inevitably, we are not going to do a whip stitch. We are going to do a ladder stitch or mattress stitch. So, and this time I am going to, you could stitch on the inside, but I am going to use a knot at this point because I want it to be able to be hidden. And I'm going to do it here. So again, I'm just going to pull it through my thread, but you can see my needle is not going to be visible on the outside, so none of my stitching will be visible on the outside. And I'm going to pull that through, and then my knot is holding that. Okay. And just as before, I'm going to begin by putting my needle through right at the corner. Okay, and I'm going to do it again and pull my needle through because I still want my corner to be as secure as I possibly can. But now what I'm going to do, I'm going to sort of pinch this between my fingers. So this is the seam I'm stitching and I want to kind of be able to hold that. And I want to be able to do as much of my stitching hidden as possible. So underneath on the blue, a short stitch, straight across underneath on the pink, a short stitch. Okay, back onto the blue. So the stitches across are the shortest possible length, and the stitches underneath, hidden behind the fabric, can be a little bit longer. Okay, and every few stitches I just pull that tight, and you'll find that the thread practically disappears. Okay, underneath the blue, across and underneath the pink, underneath the blue, across and underneath the pink. So I'm going to stitch to the end of this seam. If you, like me, have used your pre-cut hexagons, they should fit pretty accurately. If you've cut your own, all bets are off. They're still probably more accurate than mine. Accuracy is never my forte, and this kind of patchwork is not all that forgiving for those of us who are poor at accuracy. And you will find this is a little bit fiddly, trying to hold the seam where you want it as you stitch it, particularly as you get towards the corner. But again, you can be quite rough manhandling your fabric and your fibre fill. Okay, going and I'm getting towards the corner now, back under the blue, one more under the pink. You can always do the stitches with the fabric further apart actually, and then pull them tight. Okay, and then back right in at the corner and pull it tight. Okay, and a second one at the corner, and the needle underneath to lock it in place. Okay, now you'll see that has come out of place, and that's fine. We're just now going to pop that back into place. Okay, that whole corner is now done, so I can push my stuffing up into there, and now I'm going to work along this seam. Okay, I'm not going to add in any more at this point. I'm going to wait till I get to the last seam and see if I want to add any more when I get there. Okay, I would recommend for this part cutting yourself enough thread to do all 3 seams in one go. You don't need the extra faff of stopping and starting. So we've got a corner, and we'll just pop our needle through. Okay, and then I'm going under the yellow. Oh, I keep getting caught on the corner of the pillow, under the blue. I do think you will find this slightly easier doing it without a camera in your way. Okay, nice short stitches, take your time. Okay, remember this is on the bottom anyway. It's not the end of the world if this is not the neatest seam that anyone's ever seen. Also, I think there's something a little bit deceiving about the way you do these quilt-as-you-go hexagons. It kind of looks like the obvious seam is here, rather than between the fabrics somehow. So I think it does slightly draw people's attention away from these final trickier seams. Okay. Make sure you want the corner's going to end up at the same place. Blue. I don't know how much of this you can see, I'm sorry. This is not straightforward to film, but hopefully you've got the idea of it. I'm going to say Emma's probably got a great video on this, doing ladder stitch. If you've never done ladder stitch before, you might want to practice it on a flat piece rather than the first time you've ever done it, doing it on this cushion. But, you know, it's fine, take your time. The thing with hand sewing is very easy to undo. If you make a mess of it, very easy to undo. You've got no raw edges that are going to come apart, nothing that's going to fray. So, you know, take your time, do it again if you need to. Okay, so I've got to the end of that seam. So I've just got this one last seam here, and I think I am going to put an extra little bit of stuffing in here. I think usually I find I want to add an extra little bit of stuffing when I've done that last little bit, and maybe I'll just want a little bit more to make allowance for this corner that I'm about to sew up. Always more than you think. Always more than you think. Okay, I think that'll do. I think that looks nice. I think that looks nice from the front. So then I'm just going to stitch up that final seam. And if you're really struggling with your ladder stitch, obviously you can whip stitch this. It just will be more visible. Okay, make sure your stuffing's actually inside. There we go. Okay, and in some ways, Yeah, what I'm going to try to do here, I'm not going to try and pinch the seams together. I'm just going to stitch it. So I do want a bit more of that in. Right at the end. There. Okay. Okay, and I'm sort of going to do this flat rather than try and pinch them together because that is how things are. But I'm still going to do it, the ladder stitch. And what I'll do, under the green, under the blue, and you can see as I'm sort of making the stitches, it looks like there's going to be quite a big gap between the pieces of fabric. But every few stitches, and you don't have to do it every few stitches, you can write in, just give it a little pull and it will tighten up and the stitches disappear. There we go. That is a bit easier at this point. I also don't recommend doing this standing up, but it seems to be the easiest way to film, so that's what we're doing. Okay, and I'm coming up to the corner. So before I finish my corner, you can see there's a sort of gap here. So I'm going to pull, and it's going to tighten all the way along there. Then I'm put in my second little corner stitch. And do my final little hook through. And then what I quite like to do at this point is tie a knot like maybe an inch or so away from the end. Okay, and then I'm going to plunge my needle in, back where it's come out, and put it out right through the back, out here. Make sure that's all there. Tug it enough to make sure that the needle has actually, the knot has actually gone through the fabric, and then push down with your scissors, chop it off, all finished. So that's what it looks like from the back. Ta-da! That's what it looks like from the front. And that is how you finish a hexagon pillow.